Welcome back. So far, we've covered the why of prescribed burning, that fire ecology and fire adaptation that many species have. And we've covered the what part of fire. What is fire and what shapes its behavior? Now, what we want to do is orchestrate that what and why into what it takes to implement a prescribed burn on the landscape. And so that's what we'll cover in this next segment. To do that, I will move to get my PowerPoint up. I have to share screens. It's hard to think and move your fingers at the same time. All right, here we go. So for burning techniques, that is taking all this fire behavior stuff and really orchestrating it into a coherent plan of action for getting fire on the ground safely and effectively. So the first thing you need to know when you're orchestrating the parts of fire is you need to know there are three basic types of fire: a head fire, a backing fire, and a flanking fire. And let me go through each of those in part, and then I'll show you some videos just so that you can see things in real life. So a head fire is basically, if you think for all three of these pictures, the wind is coming from the same direction, from our left and going to our right. And if you think of the top of the picture being north, that would be a west wind in each of these three cases. So the wind doesn't change in each of these three cases, the wind direction anyways. So a head fire is simply fire that is moving in the same direction that the wind is moving. And that is a very intense fire. The flame length is measured from the tip of the flame to the base of the flame here. So this flame length might be 10 or 15 feet. The flame length is long. The rate of spread of the fire is fast. It's a type of fire that you can't or wouldn't want to try to outrun. You can see that there's already spot fires that are occurring ahead. You can see with the flames out here that this vegetation is preheating and getting dried out even further, which furthers the combustion rates of the fire. So everything with a head fire is about building and total consumption. And so when the fire is moving in the same direction of the wind, it's a very dangerous sort of fire to use. As such, it tends to be the last fire that we'll use in any particular circumstance, or we'll use it under very explicit and controlled situations. At the other end of the extreme is a fire that is moving in the same or in the opposite direction of the wind. So the wind is still coming from left to right, but the fire is backing, going in the opposite direction of that wind. So in contrast, when you look at the fire here, the flame length is only about 1 or 2 feet long. It's moving very slowly as it creeps in, and it consumes a lot of fuel. And actually, there's more unit energy around any particular stem per unit time than there is with a head fire. So a head fire is intense heat, but for short duration, whereas a backing fire is significant heat for a long period of time, but it's not quite so intense and all-encompassing. So a backing fire is the easiest to control fire, and it's the fire typically then that prescribed burns often start with, so that you are working with the easiest to control fire, and then ending essentially with a head fire, which is the most difficult fire to control. The flank fire is everything in between. So basically the fire is moving in the direction of the arrow, and that's perpendicular to the direction of the wind. So in this case, the fire is moving this way and the wind is moving this way. And what you get with a flanking fire, as you might guess if you had to think about it, is a flanking fire is intermediate in intensity and in flame length and in rate of spread between a head fire and a backing fire. And the reason for that is that there's all kinds of micro factors that influence how fast that fire is spreading. So sometimes a flanking fire can look like a backing fire, and sometimes it can look like a head fire. And generally, it's moving in that perpendicular direction to the line of wind. So you see this line of fire that's roughly parallel to the line of spread of the wind, and that fire is then going to be going in that perpendicular direction. So sometimes it looks like a head fire, sometimes it looks like a backing fire. And sort of if you're looking at fire and you're having a hard time to distinguish whether it's a backing fire or a head fire, it's probably a flank fire. So it's kind of got those intermediate characteristics. And flanking fires can be very useful, and we'll talk about that as we move along in this particular conversation. To show you some of this in real time, in real pictures, I'm going to take you to a website where I have many of my burn materials, and we'll show you some of these types of fire with video so that you can see some movement and so on, and that will hopefully make a little bit of sense to you. So first, we'll do a backing fire. So here we're set up for the backing fire. The wind is coming from the left and going to the right, and the fire is backing from the right and going left. So this flame length is probably 2.5 to 3 feet, but you can see that rate of spread is very, very slow as the fire is creeping into the wind. All right, so that's the backing fire. A flanking fire, so that's going to be intermediate in characteristics between the head fire and the backing fire. So again, the wind is coming from the left, going to the right, and in this case, the fire is moving directly away from us. So in that line that's perpendicular to the rate of spread is perpendicular to the direction that the wind is going. So I want to take you through this last sequence a little bit. I'm going to back it up 2 ways, and what I want you to notice is that while we're watching that flanking fire, we're going from a pretty typical flanking fire, and there's a slight change in the wind direction, or maybe in an eddy of the wind, I don't know which, but there's a change in the wind direction, and that fire becomes a little bit of a head fire, and you'll see the fire move more rapidly in the direction that's perpendicular to the line of the wind, so that the wind is not constant, and that's why a flanking fire can sometimes take on characteristics of being a head fire. And then later on in the sequence, you'll see where the wind changes again, and it takes on characteristics that are more typical of a backing fire. And you'll see the flanking fire characteristics, and then a little bit of the head fire characteristics, and then finally, again, the backing fire characteristics. So I'll play this again. There's a backing fire. See, a spot fire had occurred when there is that little bit of a head fire. That's much more of a backing fire. So that wind is not quite constant throughout that imagery. So a flanking fire is very, very sensitive to slight changes in the wind direction, so that you'll have sometimes something that looks a bit like a head fire and sometimes something that looks a bit like a backing fire. In general, a flanking fire basically makes you feel uncomfortable because it's not stable and it's constantly fluctuating between head fire and backing fire. And if you're a squad boss or a fire boss who's responsible for this burn, you care whether that is becoming a head fire permanently because you have a change in wind directions, or whether you're just getting a slight variation in the wind that's only temporary in nature. And so it always makes you nervous when you see that fire behavior changing. So I'm going to run this through one more time, just so you can see that whole sequence. So the first set of the sequence is pretty characteristic of a flanking fire, and then it moves into a head fire a little bit, and then also moves into a backing fire. So this is the flank fire. Now, fire behavior is changing. There, it's becoming a little bit more of a head fire. See, it's moving much more perpendicular to the direction of the wind, but the smoke is still carrying in a true direction. So you know it's a local effect. And now it's settling back into a backing fire again. And you saw when it took on characteristics of a head fire, that rate of spread increased dramatically. And now that rate of spread is very slow. All right, so that's a flanking fire. Flanking fires make you nervous. And then finally, we have a image of a head fire. And this is not the best image of a head fire, but it's okay because it's not completely a head fire. It's a little bit of a flanking fire as well, but you'll see more characteristics of a head fire than a flanking fire in this. So see these long flame lengths here? Long flame lengths here. This is 15, 20 foot, maybe 25 feet flame length. And so this would be typical of a, see now it's kind of flanking a little bit. That's why this fire is slowing down in its rate of spread. So basically it was started off as a head fire and then went back to a flanking fire. I'll show that one more time just so that you can catch that. That's the head fire. It's moving very quickly, long flame lengths, nothing you want to get in front of. And now all of a sudden it's backing up into a flanking fire now. See, all of a sudden that rate of spread slows down and you see more swirling in the fires, you see more fire whirls, and that would be typical of a change in the direction of the fire. Okay. I'm gonna just back out of my link. If anybody's interested in these materials, you're more than welcome to them, and I can add you to the box. So I guess I'm trying to come back to here. All right. So now basically most fires that we implement involve in one way or another most of those types of fire. They'll involve backing fires and flanking fires and head fires, but to differing degrees. The most integrated of all fire strategies or ignition techniques is the ring fire technique. And we'll start that first, but we'll talk about a couple of other techniques first. So if you're going to burn a whole unit with a backfiring technique, it would be a very slow thing. So if the wind is coming in this direction, you would start your fire there and you would be backing this up. And if, as you saw with a backing fire, it's a very slow rate of spread. So if you're going to burn 40 acres, it would take 8 hours to back from, back for, something that would be close to a quarter mile in length if it's a square 40-acre unit. So it would take a very long time. And the way they do that is when they're using just a backing fire to burn a particular area, they have a number of fire breaks and they can simultaneously light fires along these so that they have numerous backing fires that are occurring simultaneously. So this fire is the point furthest downwind and they secure this first and then they start this on fire and then they light this and they can light several of these. And so you see that they have a plow line here. Any fire break will do, and we'll talk about what constitutes a good fire break in a little bit. But basically, they have several fires that are going at one time or going simultaneously, and each of those is a backing fire, and that is a way that you can burn a larger area, but using the safest fire possible. The difficulties with it is it's very slow, and in order to speed it up, you have to have a large number of fire breaks, and so it's very time consuming in order to prepare a unit for that. Another technique is using flanking fires, and sometimes these are called chevrons because of this characteristic private stripe caricature of the fire, but this is a flanking fire technique. And basically, if this is your downwind line, the wind's coming from the north or the top of the picture, so you start your fire down here. And what you do basically is have a person who's lighting the fire here along the road, a person here lighting the fire, a person here lighting the fire, a person here lighting the fire. And typically you'd have somebody lighting fire just along the creek, which is also your a fire break on the side. So you have a road and a creek and a control line here, so that when you're moving that fire forward, the fire, because it's a flanking fire, the wind's coming in this direction, the fire is going in a direction perpendicular to that. By having a number of igniters, you're allowing that fire to consume or to merge frequently. And so you can burn this more efficiently, and that can, one of the advantages of a flanking fire technique, for example, is that you don't have animals that get captured within a ring, and you can um, uh, burn it out faster than you would with a backing fire technique. The challenge with this is that you have people who are in dangerous situations. So if you get a sudden wind shift, if this person gets a little ahead of this person and then suddenly the wind bends over to the northeast, you're sending fire towards this person. So you need careful coordination amongst these internal ignition specialists as they're moving along. And in general, the flanking technique is more at risk of a larger change in fire direction, because you never have anything that's controlling your your upwind areas of the particular unit. So a flanking fire is often used, though. I use it in long, narrow strips, especially if part of what I'm lighting under is underneath a power line, because a flanking technique keeps the heat down underneath the power line and moves the fire quickly out to either side of the line without too much heat being directed up towards the line. And so a flanking technique is often used in that sort of circumstance. A flanking technique is also really good to use when, say, if you had a building or something that is sensitive to heat. When you are moving a flanking fire away from that building, the fire is going off to either side, and that reduces the amount of heat being put for a period of time on that structure that's downwind of where you're lighting. So that's good if you've got a house, a electrical transformer box, or things like that, to use a flanking technique. Now, sometimes you can also do it. It's sort of like the backfire technique, but in this case, you're using a head fire technique, but you're using small head fires. And so we call it a strip fire technique. So strip fire essentially meaning small head fires where you can control the head fire that you're lighting. So again, you have a fire break here. Basically you can, if the wind's coming from the north, you have a fire here, so you light along the base of the line and you let it back burn here, and then you can light a strip fire coming this way, and this burns it out. And then you can light a strip fire going this way, and this burns out. And then you can light a strip fire going this way. Now that's sort of one person going back and forth. You can have several people lighting strip fires. And like with the flanking fire, you have to be very careful with this, because if this person gets ahead of this line, they're lighting a head fire towards that person, which is a dangerous circumstance. And so you want to always make sure that the farthest upwind torch is lagged behind the lines of fire that are downwind. And so a strip fire technique requires a great deal of coordination, the most amount of coordination and the most care that's being taken. But you can burn out an area a little bit more quickly using head fires and still not encircling the particular unit. So those are three techniques that can be used: a backfire technique, a strip fire technique, and a flanking fire technique in burning a unit. But many of the times, the safest kind of technique that you can use is called a ring fire technique. And so we'll talk about that now. And a ring fire technique explicitly uses all three types of fire in coordination with each other: the backing fire, the flanking fire, and the head fire. And basically what it does is, if you get wind, in this case coming out of the northwest, you would start in your downwind area. And so the first fire that you're lighting going in this direction and in this direction is primarily a backing fire, in that it's going into the wind. It might have some characteristics of a head fire, but generally it's a backing fire. As you wrap around and start going this way, where you're walking parallel to the direction of the wind, The fire is going in this direction, perpendicular to where the wind's going, so it would be a flanking fire. Same thing here. As a person's walking along here, this person is currently lighting a flanking fire, meaning that the wind's coming in this direction, the fire is going in this direction. And so you start with a backing fire, you burn out a blackened area, then you are lighting flanking fires, and then basically up here and here, which we would call points of commitment, you are lighting a head fire, fire that's going with the wind. So you start with a safer fire, you then move to a slightly more dangerous fire once you have bigger fire breaks that are constructed that are good because they're black. And then finally, you're going to light a head fire, and these two torches are going to meet, and the fire is ringed. And that head fire is the most dangerous fire, and yet you have the safest conditions in which to light that most dangerous fire. So again, the ring fire technique combines all three types of fire. It's the most commonly used technique in prescribed burns, but it's not the only technique. At least I think it's probably one of the safest techniques to use, but it requires a bit more skill in order to implement it safely. But it is safest because it keeps all crew members outside of the unit and is most amenable to protecting yourselves from variations in wind direction and things like that. It can be more risky for animals if they are caught within that ring of fire. And so there are some costs to that. So let's break down using the ring fire technique in greater detail. So the first is sort of the starting out point, and any ring fire typically has 4 points that are in common with it. It has a point of origin, and that point of origin is going to be the part of your unit that is farthest downwind. So in this case, we have wind coming from left and going right. So you can call it a west wind if you wish. So the point of origin is the farthest downwind or the farthest to the east that the unit runs. The second points, there are two, one on each side of your break, and that is called the point of commitment. And basically what that means is if you start at the origin and you have one crew moving in this direction and the other crew starting at the origin and moving in this direction, the point of commitment is where you switch from lighting either backing or flanking fires to lighting head fires. So the point of commitment is going to be in these two areas where you've rounded the corner, and generally all of this area downwind is black. And when the two igniters are lighting fire going to the tie point, the final point in our prescribed fire, they are going to be lighting head fire, a fire that's predominantly going with the wind, and this whole area will burn out rather quickly. So it takes about 2/3 of the time to cover about 1/3 of the area, and that final, in the ring fire, the final third burns out very rapidly, or the final 2/3 of the fire burns out in about 1/3 of the time. So the important point and what's meant by the anchor point in these two pictures is you want to make sure that near the point of commitment, when you're going to be lighting fire that's going with the wind or very dangerous fire, you want to make sure that the fire is burned all the way to the edge of the break, and these breaks do not have fire that's creeping across them, so that these breaks are well anchored, especially on these corners, because what you don't want is fire to creep around the outside and then go like this. And then again, the final point of the fire is this tie point where the two torches come together, thus creating a ring, and that's at the point farthest upwind of the origin. In order to advance this, our point of origin in this particular unit was right back here, and you can see the two lines of fire, one line coming out this way and one line coming out this way. And what this fire boss has done is he's just lit a strip fire across here that's going to burn out this area very quickly. You can see already the flame lengths here are longer than the backing fire here. So this is the head fire, this is the backing fire, and it's tied from the point of fire here, and it goes all the way to the point of fire here. So this area will become black. And so that creates this blackened triangle, which makes this a much safer distance, or a much safer area, because it's much more difficult to fire to go over this distance. And when it's above 150 feet, it's basically there's under the conditions that we would do prescribed fires under, there's very little chance that any embers can cross over your brake and start a fire outside of the unit. And so what that's doing is if this area is so black that you don't have to worry about, it reduces your area of risk where your brake is the most narrow to here and here. So it's basically reducing the amount of area where you're at risk of a spot fire occurring so that you can focus your crew and focus your resources on relatively small areas. And so that's what's happening in this picture is they're burning out this corner so that this person who's watching to make sure that this strip fire doesn't cause a spot fire across the break, they can move along up to closer to the igniter who's way up here. So it's a way of managing your crew by burning out these downwind areas so that you don't have to worry about them as much. So once once you're at your points of commitment, and this basically shows the two people with torches at the points of commitment, and these areas is black. Um, Once you move to tie, once you move to go to that tie point, you can light hotter fires. So this is a strip fire that makes sure that everything is black here and there's no risk that a fire is going to jump over this area. And so you're securing the edges. All of this is black. You've checked back to the corner, and there's a number of things. If you're the fire boss who's directing these two lines, there's a number of things that that fire boss wants to make sure is correct or in place before they direct the two lines to meet at the tie point. And the reason for that is once you are lighting that head fire, you're not going to be putting it out with any of the resources, even if you have engines um, that exist. And so the only way it's going to get put out is by the fire to burn itself out and remove fuel. Remember the fire triangle? One way to put out a fire is to remove the fuel. So once that ring fire has burned all of the vegetation that's in the middle of that unit, it goes out because there's no longer any fuel. And so, but before you do that, since you have this fuel, you have intense fire, and it's completely ringed by fire, you want to make sure you know where all your crew is. You want to make sure that you've refilled your resources, whether it be drip torch fuel or whether it be water for your pump can, or that your mechanical pump is charged and ready to go. You want to make sure that your crew is rehydrated so they are filled with water. You want to make sure your crew knows where the tie point is. So all of these basic sorts of things you need to get ready before you light that very intense and risky fire. Now, the nice thing is at the points of commitment at these two locations, you can sit and wait for a period of time before moving to tie so that those sorts of things can be done. A good squad boss or a good fire boss is going to orchestrate their crew so that they don't have to wait too long at the point of commitment, and they're pretty ready to go by the time they get to the point of commitment in case the burn boss wants to send them to tie very soon after they get to their point of commitment. But if need be, they can sit and check back to the point of origin to make sure everything's secure, find a member of their crew that might be internal in the unit. They refill with water or get more drip torch fuel. They can do any of these number of things while they're at the point of commitment without being pushed or advanced by the fire. You never want the fire to dictate what you should do. You always want to be dictating what the fire should do. That's what prescription is all about. And so that securing the edges and getting things black and making sure that you have enough black in the area so that your head fire will be safely contained. Those are all things that are being done before you're getting ready to move to tie. And that's what's meant by you can have longer flame lengths, you get more black, you secure the edges, you make sure you're ready to go. The final step then is to move to tie. So here, if we get wind from the northwest, we have a point of origin down here. We have a point of commitment here and a point of commitment somewhere here. Of course, this is kind of indistinct, but you'll get a pretty good feeling that when the torch is moving from here to here and here to here, you're going to be tying this off and having this burned in. And you can see that most of this area is black, so 2/3 of the unit might already be black. But this will burn very, very quickly, this final portion of the site. When you're moving these torches to tie, you want to make sure that this person who's lighting knows exactly where to go. You want to make, and oftentimes the burn boss might change the tie point in the course of the burning because they've learned from the weather that they're experiencing during the burn that the planned tie point isn't appropriate. And so you want to make sure that if it's a new tie point, that it's clear where these people are going to meet, that they have enough drip torch fuel to get to that tie point. And in this case, the person is less experienced, and so they have somebody who's going with them to make sure that what they are doing is safe. And you can see as they move along, this head fire is getting a longer flame length and it's getting hot enough that you have to be very careful that the radiant heat doesn't prevent you from getting close to the fire. So this person needs to walk at a very rapid clip, and they can use a lot of fuel when they're lighting at this time. If you miss a spot, it's no big deal. It will rapidly fill in. You want to just make sure that you're getting fire lit and moving quickly because it gets very hot. But you also need to make sure that you know where you are going. And so again, all of these, before you move to tie, you want to know, do you have enough black area to contain the ring fire? Does your crew have all the resources that they need to finish? And if not, you need to acquire them. Does your crew know the ignition plan, and has that plan changed? And does the crew know the new rendezvous point? Have you checked back to the origin? Do you know where your crew is? Um, all of those things are important to ask. And then the final thing is when you are ready to move to tie, you have to proceed quickly to tie off, and then you wait for the fire to draw in on itself before putting down the edges. And I'll show you in the next section, after we talk about, orchestrating these parts, I'll show you a video that in the end shows that fire drawing in on itself. So this will make a little bit more sense when we get to that point. So tying off then is the two torches meet, and this fire draws in on itself. You can see that this person and the point over here, they're moving to tie. You can see how long these flame lengths are, and that's a good indication of why you need to walk very quickly, because once the flame lengths are here, the radiant heat from that is enormous, and you have to be quite careful. So this is just a good example of when you're moving to tie, why you need to move quickly. And you can see these two lines are ready to ring this fire. And you can also see that here, this backing fire, and this is the head fire on obviously the same fire and the same fuels. And you can see there's a tremendous difference in the fire behavior between those two types of fire. After the fire has been burned out, there is mop up. And so the general rules of thumb is you want to walk all the breaks, and you need to put everything dead out within 30 feet of the edge of the break. So that's about 10 meters ish. And everything gets dead out so that there's no chance of things spotting across your break if people are not immediately there or immediately watching the unit after the fire has been done. You need to double that distance if high winds are expected, so up to about 60 feet if you're going to have higher winds. You need to look for snags that are burning up high, because if they're burning up high, they can throw embers for a further distance. And you may have to leave somebody behind to monitor through the night. So that's what we call babysitting. Another way of babysitting is if I'm doing a prescribed burn for a different individual, I'll turn the fire over after we've done the initial mop up. So after everything's put out to within 30 feet, I'll turn the fire over to the private landowner and say, okay, you need to be checking on this fire periodically. I'll tell them how often they need to be checking on that fire, and they need to report into me so that I can record how long it takes for a fire to go out. Oftentimes, when you're burning woody units, it might take 2 or 3 days before it to be dead out. And by law, that is illegal. What is important is the law says that a fire has to be out by midnight of the day of the fire. But oftentimes, if somebody is controlling the fire or monitoring that fire and the conditions are safe, people will allow, usually the DNR or often fire chiefs, if you're communicating with them, will be comfortable with letting that proceed as long as you're monitoring it and as long as the weather is not too volatile or too windy or too low of humidity, conditions like that in the following days. If you have a period of very high winds, 30 or 40 miles an hour, you might need to do further mop up in order to enable a person to make sure that that fire is dead out, because those are conditions that are too difficult to just simply monitor, and the risk of a spot fire occurring is too great. As a reminder, you are responsible for that fire until it is dead out. And if you turn it over to the landowner, technically they're responsible, but you're still going to, it will reflect on you as a burn boss if that fire does escape. And so it needs to be rechecked. I have daily here. Generally, I have people check in the morning and again in the evening. And if it's somewhat volatile conditions, during the midday, so that you're checking that frequently enough that you're knowing that the things that are still burning are safe. They're just safely contained within the unit. Now, the advantage of taking this approach is that you are removing more fuel by letting some of those heavier fuels burn, and that can be a good thing. So you can be removing fuels like this that will burn out as long as they're well contained within the unit and being watched. So I've talked about fire breaks in the course of this, and fire breaks are um, basically any place where you can light fire safely. And by lighting fire safely, that means that they have no fuel or reduced amount of fuel so that you can control fire to keep it from going with the wind and allowing it to back into the wind, assuming that you're always lighting um, with a backing fire at first. So a fire break can be mineral soil that's done by raking or blowing through the woods. It can be a road. It can be mineral soil that's bulldozed, and this is what often suppression crews will do, is putting in a bulldoze line. It can be an area that's mowed grass, just with mowed grass, so the vegetation is cut and the vegetation removed. Um, Oftentimes, if it is cut, people will follow it up with a wet line. But it's important that when you put this water down, if it's a low humidity day, that you're following up by burning fairly quickly, because this water can dry off very rapidly. But all of these are creating fire breaks where you're making the fuel non-burnable by having it inert or mineral soil or asphalt in these three cases, or you've removed some of the fuel and you're preventing that fuel from burning with a wet line. What kind of break you have will determine what kind of experience that you need with a crew that's working with you. If you're with people who don't have much experience working with a fire, having an inert break is safer than having a grassy break, because this requires people to use their equipment more effectively, to patrol more frequently, to look for fire creeping across the break, and to know what's really going on. Whereas an inert break has less of a chance of fire creeping across it. So a fire break, again, is any strip which has no fuel, so it will stop a fire that moves towards it. And generally, we're lighting a fire that would be backing along that break rather than fire going towards it. And so you can see, again, the difference between a head fire and a backing fire on this same line. And so this would be the fire break, which appears to be a two-track road where there's not much vegetation in between the tracks. Another example is this break is mowed, and then the materials are removed from that break so that there's no down dead material standing right next to the break. And so if you're going to burn this unit, you might light your backing fire right along the edge here, or if you're burning this unit, you might light backing fire right along here. So you need to be able to light fire safely. Generally, a fire break should be 2 to 3 times the height of the vegetation that's adjacent to it. So this is little blue stem, and you want to be 3 times the width of that little blue stem to make sure embers are not from a backing fire are not able to blow across it. Using existing barriers certainly can lessen your work in creating these fire breaks. And um, there's any number of different ways that you can actually make a fire break, and we'll go through some of those here with a few examples. So a mode break, you can see the mode break right here, and this is a very good break. See how nice and straight that line was? And they probably used a wet line along it, but you can get these kinds of results if you're using a flapper well, and we'll talk about the equipment here momentarily. Um, and you can put out any backing fires, but this break worked extremely well, and they had this no burn areas here, and you can see right here is the fire break that they put around this area that they didn't want to burn. And so this is just another example where mode breaks are used. You want to mow as close to the ground as possible. All of the debris should be removed from the break, and the debris should be raked outside of the unit, not inside of the unit. Oftentimes people will pile up the materials right along this edge, and what that's doing is making the fire that you're lighting at first more intense and burning for a longer period of time. And what that does is slow down the rate of movement of your crew along this line. Because if there's more fuel here, you have to go slower to let that fuel burn out. And if this break isn't as wide as it should be, it can create more danger for ember to go across that break and light a spot fire. And sometimes you might need to use a wet line during the burn if even though the material is removed from this, fire can still creep in this. So if you're at 30% relative humidity and a 10-mile-an-hour wind, you might see ribbons of black that come way out into here because it's easier for fire to creep through the remaining fuel. A wet line can reduce that if it's used in coordination with the mode brake. If you have 50% relative humidity and a 5-mile-an-hour wind, uh, a mode break like this generally wouldn't require much water. So there's an interaction between a grassy break and how safe it is, and therefore the experience of your crew, the experience of the burn boss, when you're using burn or mode breaks like this is very important to consider because it can take more experience to manage this safely. Bare soil breaks or inert breaks, are anything you can scratch it in with a fire rake, you can scratch it in with a leaf rake, you can use a bulldozer, you can use existing roads, um, but basically anything where you can use a leaf blower, anything that exposes bare mineral soil can be used. Again, leaves should be raked or moved outside of the unit, not piled up on the inside of the unit. Plows and rototillers can be used to create a bare soil break, even in grassland units, but it creates a very high level of disturbance that surrounds your area. And so that creates problems for invasive weed species to come in. So it can be a way, especially in prairies, of getting really nice, easy fire breaks to use so that you don't have to have many crew or your crew doesn't have to be very experienced, but there are some costs to it, not just in terms of making the break, but in terms of invasive species management that follows afterwards. So you have to be careful about what type of inert break that you use. Another type of break is you can burn in breaks. I'll do a whole section or lecture on how to burn in breaks, and so that will come later. But the basic gist is you're removing fuel from the break by just burning it. But what's important is this is prescribed burning so that we choose our weathers to achieve the objectives that we have in mind. And in the case of burning breaks, we choose cooler weather in order to burn in breaks more safely because we don't have many other breaks that are around it. And that's the primary example that I just want to talk about now. The advantage of burning in breaks is you can burn in breaks on steep slopes, you can burn in breaks on rocky ground, you can burn in breaks in shrubby areas where it's very difficult to create a fire break through other means, through mowing or through leaf raking or using a leaf blower and things like that. You can try to locate them next to existing barriers such as paths, deer paths, cow paths, things like that can be fine breaks under the conditions that you would burn a break under. And then you just make those bigger by burning out around them. But you're burning in breaks in the least hazardous conditions possible. And I won't go into detail in terms of what that means, but basically you're choosing your weather differently to burn breaks than you would to actually burn the unit. This is the only type of brake that can be used anywhere. And it, if you choose your weather correctly, it's very easy. If you don't choose your weather correctly, it can be dangerous and very difficult. So the real challenge with burning in brakes is choosing your weather correctly or the objectives at hand. Burning brakes is probably the oldest way that people have utilized brakes. And so this is a picture of Alda Leopold burning brakes at the UW Arboretum. They're burning a brake that's approximately 10 meters wide. They're using burlap sacks stuffed with dead vegetation and soaked in water to use as flappers to put out the edges of these brakes. And so, it's a very old technique, but it can be a very effective one. Finally, then there's what do you wear in order to be safe and keep yourself safe? You want to have flame retardant materials if you can. Shirts that have flame retardant materials are very useful because not only do they not catch fire like cotton could, and they don't melt like nylon can, but they also can reflect heat so that they can actually keep you comfortable when you're working very closely with fire. If you don't have fire retardant clothing, you can substitute it with cotton clothing. You want to have the materials as natural as possible, and you want leather boots. And importantly, in this day and age, those leather boots should not have nylon panels in them because those nylon panels can melt. And gloves are very much a necessity too, because your body part of exposed skin that's closest to fire is with your gloves. Baseball hats, if you're in prairies, are useful. If you're not in prairies, hard hats are important in woods. And actually, I've come to use hard hats in the grasslands as well, because you just never know when you're going to get bonked by somebody's wand or things like that. And so hard hats can be useful pretty much any time that you are burning. The basic equipment can be as fancy as having 150 gallons of water in a tank on a pickup truck with a great mechanical pump and a good hose lays and things like that. And those can be very useful, especially when you're doing larger fires. But you can also get an awful lot done with very simple equipment, such as a back can or a pump can that sits on your back, carries 5 gallons of water, and you use um, a wand to spray the water, a flapper, and the basic gist is this is using water to put out fire. So you're reducing heat and smothering the fire. A flapper is smothering the fire, and then you have a drip torch in order to light the fire. And these three simple pieces of equipment can go a long ways in doing quite a lot of burning in Wisconsin. They can become limited when you're talking about burning several hundred acres or 1,000 acres. But for burns that are under 150 acres, you can do those all with pump cans and flappers and drip torches and people on foot quite readily. And I think people don't quite appreciate that as much as they perhaps should when they're working and thinking about implementing a prescribed fire. So low tech can work. That's the bottom line. And when you're using this equipment, showing respect for the people that you're working with and respect for the equipment go hand in hand. And so that often works. So helping people with back cans to be put on, things like that work very well. So in summary for this section, there are three types of fire: a backfire, a flank fire, and a head fire. A backing fire moves into the wind, a flanking fire moves perpendicular to the direction of the wind, and a head fire moves in the same direction as the wind. There are four ignition strategies: the ring fire, a flank fire technique, a backfire technique, and a strip fire technique. And then there are 5 types of fire breaks: an inert break, mowed grass, burn vegetation, wet grass, so it's mowed with some water, and then just basically water bodies. Those can be good fire breaks too. Proper PPE, personal protective equipment, and proper equipment overall are essential, but they can be simple so that you can get burning done with relatively simple equipment, although certainly you can get sometimes more done when you have fancier equipment, but of course, there is greater cost to that. So let's take a break and we'll come back momentarily.